You can't speak, so even if you saw something, no one would ever believe you. No one will ever notice this.
What is she trying to tell us?
She says the USB drive was switched.
No one knew that the Nigerian-American housekeeper had just witnessed him swapping the real USB drive containing confidential files about a community housing fund. Halima had no voice, but her hands knew how to tell the truth. And just a few days later, those silent signs would leave the entire executive board speechless. Where are you watching from today? Let us know your city in the comments below at exactly 9:45 a.m. Halima Nwosu pushed her silver cleaning cart along the glass-lined corridor of the executive lounge at Green Horizons headquarters in Midtown Atlanta. Morning sunlight reflected across the polished marble floor, making the space resemble the lobby of a five-star hotel rather than an office building. Carefully trimmed plants, paintings by African and African-American artists, and the gentle aroma of freshly brewed Ethiopian coffee created an atmosphere that felt both luxurious and welcoming. Halima wore a perfectly fitted golden-yellow uniform with a colorful Ankara pattern scarf around her neck. Her hair was neatly tied into a bun, and her white gloves were always spotless. She never allowed a fingerprint to remain on the glass or a grain of dust to sit on a table for long. Most people at the company knew that Halima could not speak. They often smiled politely as they passed her, sometimes offering a brief nod, but very few ever stopped long enough to look her directly in the eyes. To them, she seemed like part of the elegant interior present every day but rarely noticed. Halima had grown used to that. She did not resent anyone, nor did she try to make others feel sorry for her. Her only goal was to do her work better than she had the day before. Inside the executive lounge, she arranged every crystal glass at the exact required distance. She carefully straightened each leather chair and polished the dark walnut conference table. As she bent down, she noticed a small black button lying beside one of the table legs. Halima opened the notebook she always carried, wrote a short note, and placed the button inside a small plastic bag. It was a habit she had developed over the years. Whenever she found an unusual object in an area she maintained, she documented it carefully. A young female assistant entered the room while checking the meeting schedule on her tablet. "That's strange. I remember this button being on my jacket yesterday. I didn't realize it had fallen off here." Halima smiled and held out the small plastic bag. The assistant looked surprised. "Is that mine?" Halima nodded, then pointed toward the woman's collar and moved her fingers as though fastening a button. "Thank you." The assistant accepted it with a smile and quickly left the room. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but Halima felt happy that the woman had understood her without needing a single spoken word. At the far end of the hallway, two sales employees walked together while talking. "I heard the executives are about to sign another major development project. That has nothing to do with us. As long as sales remain strong, we'll be fine." One of them tilted her head toward Halima's, who was cleaning the glass. "She's been working here for a long time. I don't think I've ever heard her make a sound. Yeah, poor woman, but I suppose she's used to it." They continued walking without realizing Halima had heard every word. She did not feel angry. She had heard the phrase "poor woman" many times throughout her life. At first, it had hurt her deeply. Over time, however, she realized that most people were not trying to be cruel. They simply did not know how to look at a person with a disability without immediately feeling pity. After finishing the reception area, Halima entered the document storage room. The temperature was carefully controlled because the room contained important corporate records. She checked each shelf, wiped away the thinnest layer of dust from the metal frames, and noticed that one folder had been placed in the wrong section. Halima paused, studied the identification code printed along its spine, and returned it to its correct position. After years of working in that office, her visual memory had captured nearly the entire filing system. A short while later, the administrative manager entered. "Has anyone been in here before me?" Halima looked at him, shook her head, pointed toward the security camera on the ceiling, and then placed one hand against her chest, indicating that she had been alone since entering. He nodded. "All right, thank you. Although he did not fully understand sign language, he had gradually learned to recognize Halima's simpler gestures. Her patience had quietly encouraged several employees to communicate in ways they had never considered before. When Halima reached the balcony overlooking the city, she paused for a moment. From there, she could see Atlanta's modern skyline stretching beneath the clear blue sky. She thought of her mother, who lived outside the city and had always reminded her that any job performed with honesty and care carried dignity. That lesson had helped Halima understand that there was nothing shameful about the work she did. While replacing the trash bag in a smaller conference room, Halima noticed an expensive fountain pen beneath a chair. She picked it up carefully, cleaned it, and carried it to the reception desk. Soon afterward, a Liberian-American businessman hurried back into the lounge. "I dropped a pen that belonged to my father. Has anyone seen it?" The receptionist smiled. Halima found it and turned it in. The man looked toward Halima with visible relief. "Thank you so much. I have carried this pen with me for more than 20 years. Halima smiled, placed a hand over her heart, and bowed her head gently in response. The man became emotional. Some people don't need to say a single word to make others feel their kindness. Halima looked at him, and a quiet joy appeared in her eyes. It was not because she had been praised. It was because, for once, someone had noticed her value before noticing her disability. At the far end of the hallway, employees continued preparing for important meetings. No one noticed that the quiet woman pushing the cleaning cart could remember nearly every face, every object, and every small change across the executive floor. To most people, Halima was only a member of the service staff, yet her discipline, sharp observation, and honesty had quietly made her the keeper of details that no management system could ever replace. Those seemingly insignificant details would soon become the first pieces of a truth the entire company was unprepared to face. After completing her work in the executive lounge, Halima Nwosu pushed her cleaning cart toward the offices reserved for Green Horizons senior executives. Only employees with special access cards were allowed to enter the area freely. Service workers like Halima could work there only during approved cleaning periods. For that reason, she followed every company rule carefully. She never entered a room without permission and never opened a document that had nothing to do with her responsibilities. To most people, Halima was merely a quiet housekeeper. To her, however, the job was a commitment. Every desk had to be spotless. Every glass panel had to remain clear. Every object had to be returned to its original position. Years of discipline had trained her to remember nearly every change around her without deliberately trying to observe anyone. While polishing the glass outside the boardroom, Halima saw Victor Mensah enter with several senior executives. The glass door closed quickly behind them. The room was soundproof, so she could not clearly hear their conversation. However, through the transparent wall, she could still see their movements. Victor placed a silver USB drive on the table. Joel Okoye opened his laptop. A presentation appeared on the large screen. The other executives nodded repeatedly. Halima had no intention of watching them for long. She continued cleaning the glass and prepared to move away when a female secretary's phone suddenly rang. The secretary hurried into the boardroom, leaned close to Victor, whispered something, and handed him a blue folder. Victor frowned. He stood up. He motioned for everyone to wait. Then he picked up the silver USB drive and left the room. Halima bent down to replace a trash bag beside the door. She was not intentionally following him, but as Victor passed her, her eyes caught a tiny detail. There was a triangular scratch near one corner of the USB drive. It was a distinctive mark. Victor walked quickly toward his private office. A short while later, he returned. He was still carrying a silver USB drive. He placed it exactly where the previous one had been. To anyone who was not paying close attention, nothing appeared unusual. But Halima noticed the difference. The new USB drive had no triangular scratch. She paused for a moment. Not because she was accusing him of anything, but because his behavior was unusual. Victor was always extremely careful with his personal belongings. There was no obvious reason for him to switch USB drives in the middle of an executive meeting. Halima did not speculate. She simply remembered. When the meeting ended, the executives left the room one by one. Joel Okoye was the last to come out. He stopped when he saw Halima wiping the table. "Thank you." Halima smiled and placed one hand over her heart in response. Joel began to walk away, but then turned back. "How long have you worked on this floor?" Halima opened the notes application on her phone and showed him her answer. "More than 6 years." Joel read it and nodded. "I didn't realize it had been that long." Halima only smiled. Joel left with a thoughtful expression. A short while later, Halima began cleaning the boardroom. She collected the coffee cups, straightened the chairs, polished the table. While picking up a small note that had fallen onto the floor, she noticed a faint circular mark where the USB drive had rested. As always, she briefly observed the position of every object before cleaning the surface. It was not curiosity. She simply wanted to make sure everything was returned to its proper place. As Halima pushed her cart out of the room, she noticed Victor speaking to a man in a gray suit at the far end of the corridor. The man was not wearing an employee identification badge. Victor glanced around before discreetly handing him a brown envelope. The exchange lasted only a few seconds. The man immediately left through the private elevator. Halima stood at a distance. She could not hear what they said, but she remembered everything she could see. The color of his tie, his watch, the silver ring on his little finger, even the slight limp in his walk. That level of observation had become instinctive after years of depending on her eyes more than her voice to communicate. Later, inside the staff break room, 2 members of the service team were talking. "I heard the company is about to receive its largest community housing project yet. I hope so." A new project means stable work for everyone. One of them glanced toward Halima. She probably doesn't care. Halima merely smiled. She poured more hot tea for her co-workers and continued organizing the kitchen shelf. An older cleaning employee spoke softly. "Don't assume Halima doesn't understand simply because she can't speak. That young woman notices everything." The other worker laughed. "I know." Halima looked at them and nodded in appreciation. It was one of the rare moments when she felt that her co-workers saw her as an equal rather than as someone who needed to be pitied. At the end of her shift, Halima took out the small notebook she always carried. It did not contain company secrets. It held no customer information. There were no confidential business records inside. Only simple notes related to her work. The flower arrangement had been replaced. The coffee machine required servicing. The boardroom chairs had been moved. The hallway lights had been changed. This time, she added one short line. "Silver USB, different scratch." Then she closed the notebook. To Halima, it was merely another detail to remember, no different from the hundreds of small changes she had recorded throughout her years at the company. She had no idea that the seemingly meaningless sentence would become the first link in a chain leading to a truth the company was trying to hide. Elsewhere in the building, Victor Menza stood before the glass wall of his office, looking down at Atlanta's busy streets. A confident smile appeared on his face. Everything is done. He believed his plan was flawless. He believed no one could discover the truth, especially not the woman who could not speak and quietly polish the company's glass walls every day. What he did not know was that Halima's eyes had captured details that even the executives sitting inside the meeting had overlooked. In a story where everyone believed power would decide the truth, the precise memory of a housekeeper was quietly becoming the most valuable evidence of all. At exactly 10:26 a.m., the atmosphere on Green Horizon's executive floor was completely different from an ordinary workday. Hurried footsteps echoed across the marble floor, phones rang continuously, and employees exchanged tense whispers throughout the corridor. Rumors had begun spreading that discrepancies had been discovered in a set of internal financial records, although the company's leadership had not yet issued an official announcement. Halima Nunwosu continued pushing her cleaning cart along the hallway as she did every day. She polished the glass panels, replaced water bottles, and carefully adjusted the decorative plants outside the meeting rooms. Her responsibilities had not changed, but the atmosphere around her had. The faces that usually appeared cheerful now looked heavy with concern. Many employees passed her without even having enough composure to offer their usual polite smiles. At the far end of the corridor, the finance department door suddenly opened. Joel Okoye stepped out with a tense expression. A man in his late 30s followed closely behind him. He wore a navy blue suit that had become slightly wrinkled around the sleeves, and his employee identification badge was still pinned to his chest. His name was Samuel Adeyemi, a Nigerian-American accountant who had worked at Green Horizon for nearly 8 years. Samuel was known for being meticulous and had never been responsible for a serious financial error. Whenever the company prepared its quarterly reports, he was often the last person to leave the office. Now his eyes were red. Victor Mensah slowly emerged from his office. He looked at Samuel coldly. "You are no longer an employee of this company." Samuel drew in a deep breath. "Sir, I did not alter any of those reports." Victor folded his arms. "Your account was the last one used to access the system. That does not mean I made the changes. Are you denying the evidence?" Samuel clenched his hands. "I am asking you to investigate again. We already investigated. That cannot be true. The company cannot retain someone who has damaged its reputation." The corridor fell silent. Employees standing nearby exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Some lowered their heads, others avoided Samuel's eyes. No one wanted to become the next person whose name was called. Halima stood farther down the corridor, one hand still resting on the handle of her cleaning cart. She looked at Samuel, then at Victor. Her eyes finally settled on the blue folder being held against the assistant's chest. It was the same color as the folder she had seen carried into the executive meeting. Samuel turned toward the employees around him. "I know none of you believe me right now." A bitter smile crossed his face. "But I have never betrayed this company." One of his female colleagues spoke in a trembling voice. "Samuel," he gently shook his head, "please don't say anything." Halima studied his expression. He did not look like a man who had just been caught committing fraud. He looked like someone struggling to hold on to the last piece of his dignity. Victor turned toward the human resources manager. "Complete the termination process." "Yes, sir." Samuel slowly removed his identification badge. He placed it on the reception desk. The simple gesture made the hallway feel even quieter. Halima noticed that his hand was trembling, not from anger, from disappointment. While everyone continued watching, Halima bent down and picked up a pen that had fallen from Samuel's pocket. She walked toward him quickly, then held it out with both hands. Samuel accepted it. He looked at her for a moment and gave her a faint smile. "Thank you," Halima nodded. Then she suddenly began using sign language. Her hands moved slowly. Her eyes remained steady. She shaped her fingers to represent a USB drive. Then she moved one hand aside and replaced it with the other, mimicking an exchange. Finally, she pointed toward the boardroom. Samuel froze. He could not understand every sign, but he sensed that Halima was trying to tell him something important. "What do you mean?" Halima continued signing. This time she traced a small triangle in the air. Then she shook her head. Samuel frowned. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." Halima glanced around. She reached for a piece of paper, then quickly wrote one word. USB. At that moment, a security officer approached them. "Excuse me, Miss Halima. You should not interfere while he is completing his termination procedures." Halima immediately stepped back. She folded the paper and placed it in her pocket. Samuel looked at her with confusion, but before leaving, he still lowered his head slightly in gratitude. As Samuel entered the elevator, several employees began whispering, "I never thought it would be him. I always believed Samuel was honest. If there is evidence, why is he still denying it?" Halima listened quietly. A growing sense of unease settled inside her, not because she knew who was responsible, but because everything had happened too quickly. So quickly that no one seemed willing to ask another question. She remembered Victor leaving the room with one USB drive and returning with another. She remembered the triangular scratch. She remembered where each executive had been seated. She remembered the unfamiliar man who had received a brown envelope in the corridor, but all of those details existed only in her memory. No one had asked her what she had seen. No one knew how to listen to what she was trying to explain. Later, inside the staff break room, Halima opened her small notebook. Underneath the note about the USB drive, she wrote another sentence. "Samuel says he is innocent." She held the pen above the page for a long moment. Then she gently closed the notebook. It was not a conclusion. It was not an accusation. It was simply something she wanted to remember. Halima had always believed that human memory could fade, but details recorded honestly could prevent the truth from being lost. On the highest floor of the building, Victor Mensah stood before the window, satisfied as he reviewed the internal announcement that had just been distributed. The statement placed full responsibility on Samuel. Everything had unfolded exactly as Victor had planned. He believed the matter was closed. He believed that once someone had been chosen to carry the blame, the remaining questions would disappear. What he did not know was that, in a quiet corner of the building, the woman who had never spoken a word was preserving the pieces that no report could erase. The more people accepted Samuel's guilt, the more Halima realized that she could not remain unheard forever. Sometimes the truth does not begin with an accusation. Sometimes it begins with one person brave enough to remember what everyone else has chosen to forget. At exactly 6:42 p.m., Green Horizon's executive floor was almost empty. The floor-to-ceiling windows reflected Atlanta's orange sunset across the polished marble corridor, giving the luxurious space a quiet, almost solemn atmosphere. Most employees had already left for the day. Only the security team, a few managers working late, and the cleaning staff remained inside the building. Halima Nwosu pushed her cleaning cart toward the security control room. She replaced a trash bag, wiped the door handle, and bent down to straighten the rug near the entrance. As she stood up, the monitoring room door opened. Elijah Kamau, Green Horizon's head of security, stepped out holding a tablet. His face showed clear signs of exhaustion after several days of assisting the legal department with its review of Samuel's case. When he saw Halima, he smiled. "You're still here?" Halima smiled back and pointed toward her cleaning cart, indicating that she still had several areas left to finish. Elijah nodded. "You always seem to be one of the last people to leave." Halima gave a small shrug. During her years at Green Horizon, Elijah had been one of the few people who never looked at her with pity. He greeted her the same way he greeted every other employee. Because of that, Halima had always respected him. At that moment, a young security officer hurried out of the control room. "Mr. Kamau, what is it? There is a timing discrepancy in one of the recordings from the executive floor. I'm checking it now." Elijah took the tablet. "Show me." Halima stood nearby and happened to see the screen. The recording showed the corridor outside the executive boardroom. Her heart tightened. It was the exact place where she had seen Victor carrying the USB drive out of the meeting. Elijah studied the footage carefully. "It looks like the display time was out of sync by a few minutes." The younger officer nodded. "Yes, but the original footage is still intact." Halima immediately lifted her head. Her eyes fixed on the screen. She saw herself pushing her cleaning cart along the hallway. Then Victor appeared. He stepped out of the boardroom. A small object was visible in his hand. Halima instinctively reached toward the screen and pointed repeatedly at Victor. Elijah turned to her. "Are you trying to tell me something?" Halima nodded firmly. She moved her cleaning cart aside. Then she began using sign language. First, she formed the shape of a USB drive with 2 fingers. Next, she held out her right hand and quickly replaced it with her left. Then she shook her head. Elijah watched closely. He did not understand everything, but he did not interrupt her. When Halima finished, he spoke gently. "I'm sorry, I never learned sign language." Halima lowered her eyes. A trace of disappointment crossed her face. She reached for her phone and began opening the notes application. Just then, Elijah's radio crackled. "Chief, we need you in the parking garage immediately." Elijah glanced at the radio, then back at Halima. "I have to handle something downstairs." He paused. "But I know you're trying to tell me something important." Halima looked up. Elijah smiled. "I'll come back. Please wait for me." Halima nodded. It was the first time in days that someone had not walked away the moment she began communicating with her hands. When Elijah returned, he carried a small notebook. "I don't know sign language, but we can try another way." He placed the notebook on the table. "Write it down, only if that is comfortable for you." Halima looked at the notebook. Then at Elijah. She picked up the pen. She wrote slowly, "Camera." Then she drew a USB drive. Underneath it, she wrote another word, "different." Elijah read it. "Different?" Halima nodded. She drew a small triangle near the corner of the USB drive, then crossed it out. Elijah studied the drawing. "You mean there were 2 USB drives?" Halima immediately nodded. Her eyes brightened. For the first time, someone had understood part of what she had been trying to explain. Elijah continued. You saw this yourself? Halima nodded again. Are you certain? Halima placed one hand over her heart, then nodded firmly. Elijah fell silent. He was not a man who accepted assumptions easily. But he was also not someone who ignored suspicious details. He replayed the footage. This time, he slowed it down. Victor stepped out of the boardroom, walked toward his private office, then returned. The entire movement lasted only a short while. Without Halima's explanation, Elijah would never have paid attention to the small object in Victor's hand. He enlarged the image. The footage was not clear enough to reveal the scratch, but it was clear enough to confirm that Victor had carried a small object out of the room. Elijah spoke quietly. This may need a closer review. Halima exhaled slowly, not because she felt victorious, but because someone had finally looked in the direction she had been pointing. Elijah switched off the screen. I cannot draw any conclusions yet, but I promise you, I will not ignore this. Halima smiled. It was a small smile. But for the first time in days, her eyes no longer carried the same helplessness. Before leaving, Elijah turned back. Halima, she looked at him. Does anyone in this company know that you are fluent in sign language? Halima shook her head. Has anyone ever arranged an interpreter for you? She shook her head again. Elijah looked down at the notebook. Then he spoke slowly. That is our failure, not yours. Halima stood completely still. Throughout her life, many people had apologized because she could not speak. But no one had ever apologized because they had never learned how to listen. When Elijah walked away, he kept the notebook containing Halima's few short sentences. To most people, they were only simple words and a rough drawing. But to someone with years of security experience, they represented the kind of small detail that could change the direction of an entire investigation. Across the building, Victor Mensah was preparing to leave his office. He had no idea that the carefully planned scheme he believed was secure had just developed its first crack. It had not come from a powerful executive, a major investigation, or an influential witness. It came from a quiet woman who had never been invited into a board meeting, and from one man who had finally chosen to listen. Sometimes justice does not begin when everyone sees the truth. Sometimes it begins when one person decides that a small detail is too important to ignore. At exactly 11:08 p.m., the small conference room beside the legal department had been prepared differently from any ordinary meeting. There was no presentation screen, no stacks of thick files covering the table, and none of the senior executives were present. Instead, a round walnut table stood in the center of the room, surrounded by glasses of water, notebooks, and an atmosphere so quiet that even the soft hum of the air conditioner could be heard. Halima Nwozu stood at the doorway with her hands gently clasped together. Although she had done nothing wrong, she felt nervous. It was not because she feared being questioned. It was because, for the first time in all her years at Green Horizon, someone had invited her into a meeting room simply to hear what she wanted to say. Elijah Kama approached first. Good morning, Halima. Halima smiled and gave a respectful nod. A moment later, Dr. Ama Boteng entered the room. Beside her stood a woman in her 40s wearing a professional identification badge. Ama smiled warmly. Halima, this is Grace Williams. She is a certified American Sign Language interpreter. For a brief moment, Halima froze. For years, she had grown accustomed to two people trying to guess her meaning from a few simple gestures. Today was the first time the company had invited a professional interpreter solely to understand her. Grace stepped forward with a smile and greeted Halima in sign language. It's a pleasure to meet you. Halima's eyes widened in surprise before her face softened into a genuine smile. Her hands immediately responded in fluent, graceful signs. Grace turned to Ama. She says thank you because at last someone is speaking her language. The room fell completely silent. Ama took a slow breath. That single sentence made her realize how much the company had overlooked for so many years. Everyone took their seats. Ama spoke gently. Halima, today we are not asking you to decide who is guilty. We are not asking you to make assumptions. We simply want you to tell us exactly what you saw. Grace translated every word into sign language. Halima looked at Ama for a moment. Then she nodded. She began. Her hands moved slowly, Her expression remained calm. There was no anger. P. No emotion intended to persuade anyone. Grace translated carefully. She says she was cleaning the glass outside the boardroom. She saw Mr. Victor carrying a silver USB drive out of the room. P. Halima continued signing. Grace translated. The USB drive had a triangular scratch near one corner. Amma immediately wrote it down. Halima continued. She saw Mr. Victor walk into his private office. P. A few moments later, he came back. He was still carrying a silver USB drive. Grace paused. She is emphasizing that the second USB drive did not have the triangular scratch. P. Amma looked up. Are you certain? Grace translated the question. Halima did not answer immediately. She gently closed her hands and shut her eyes for a brief moment as though replaying the entire scene in her memory. Then she opened them. She carefully traced a tiny triangle in the air. Finally, she nodded with complete confidence. Grace smiled softly. She says she remembers because the sunlight reflected directly across the scratch as Mr. Victor walked past her. Elijah looked toward Amma. Neither of them spoke. Halima continued. She described where each executive had been seated around the table. She described the female secretary entering with the blue folder. She described Victor leaving the room, returning, placing the USB drive back in the exact same position. She never added personal opinions. Grace spoke quietly. I have worked as an interpreter for more than 10 years. What stands out is that she never speculates this. She simply described exactly what her eyes observed. Amma nodded. That was exactly what she had noticed. There were no accusations. No emotional conclusions. Only carefully organized observations presented in the order they had happened. Amma continued. Do you remember anything else? Halima paused to think. Then she began signing again. Grace translated. She saw a man wearing a gray suit. He was not wearing an employee badge. She saw Mr. Victor hand him a brown envelope. She could not hear their conversation. She does not know what was inside the envelope. She only remembers that the man walked with a slight limp. Amma immediately stopped writing. A slight limp? Halima nodded. Grace added. She also remembers that he wore a silver ring on his little finger. Elijah exchanged a glance with Amma. That detail had never appeared in any previous report. Amma slowly leaned back in her chair. Inside her mind, the scattered pieces were beginning to fit together. Samuel had been dismissed far too quickly. The security footage contained an unusual gap. There had been 2 USB drives, an unidentified visitor, a mysterious envelope. Each detail alone proved nothing. Together, they pointed toward an entirely different direction. Amma looked at Halima. Why didn't you tell us earlier? Grace translated. Halima remained silent for a long moment. Her eyes slowly filled with tears. Finally, her hands began moving again. Grace translated more slowly than before. She says she tried. She used sign language. She wrote the word USB, but everyone assumed she had misunderstood. No one in the room spoke. Halima continued signing. I did not need everyone to believe me. I only needed someone willing to listen. As Grace finished translating, Amma lowered her head. A lump formed in her throat. As the company's chief legal officer, she had always believed Green Horizon respected diversity and inclusion. Now she realized they had made a terrible mistake, not because they had overlooked evidence, but because they had overlooked the person carrying it. Amma stood up. She walked over to Halima. Instead of offering a formal handshake, she bowed her head slightly. Halima, Grace translated. Thank you, and I am sorry. Halima looked at her with surprise. Amma continued. I am sorry it took us so long to learn how to listen to you. Halima smiled gently. It was a peaceful smile. There was no sense of victory. She had never wished for anyone to be punished. She had only wanted the truth to have a chance to be heard. When the meeting ended, Elijah carefully placed the signed statement into the investigation file. Grace said goodbye to Halima in sign language, while Amma stood quietly by the doorway, watching the small woman slowly push her cleaning cart back into the familiar hallway. The figure walking away looked exactly the same as every other day, yet in Amma's eyes, Halima was no longer simply a housekeeper. She had become the company's most credible witness because she had never tried to accuse anyone. She had simply preserved every detail until someone finally respected her enough to ask one simple question. What exactly did you see? That question changed the direction of the entire investigation. More importantly, it reminded everyone that justice can exist only when every voice, even though spoken without sound, is treated with equal dignity and respect. At exactly 2:17 p.m., the internal investigation room at Green Horizon was brightly lit. Spread neatly across the long oak conference table were dozens of organized files, laptops, backup drives containing security footage, and detailed access logs from the executive floor. The atmosphere was completely different from the company's usual executive meetings. There were no polished business presentations or ambitious growth projections. Every pair of eyes was focused on numbers, surveillance images, and small details that had once seemed insignificant. Dr. Ama Boateng spoke first. "We are not here to reach conclusions. Every finding must be supported by evidence." Elijah Kamau nodded. "That is exactly why I requested that every piece of information be verified independently." He turned on the security footage. The video played slowly. Victor Mensah appeared outside the boardroom. A small object could be seen in his hand. He walked out of the frame. Moments later, he returned. His movements appeared completely natural. No one attending the original meeting had seemed to notice anything unusual. Ama leaned forward. "Zoom in." The technician enlarged the image. The recording was not clear enough to reveal the surface of the USB drive, but it confirmed Halima's statement that Victor had carried a small object out of the meeting room before returning. Elijah opened another file. "This is the electronic door access log." A digital report appeared on the screen. Victor's name appeared twice at the entrance to his private office. The two entries were separated by only a brief interval. Ama turned toward Joel. "Was there any reason for Mr. Victor to leave the meeting?" Joel shook his head. "No, did anyone ask him to? No, did anyone accompany him?" "No." Ama wrote another note. "So leaving the meeting was entirely his own decision." Joel nodded quietly. Silence settled across the room. Elijah switched to another display. "This is the document access history," one of the IT specialists explained. The final modification occurred shortly before the meeting ended. Ama asked, "Which user account?" The technician had examined the screens. "Samuel Adeyemi's account." Joel immediately responded, "We already know that." Elijah calmly raised a hand. "Wait, what device was used?" The technician typed several commands. A moment later he frowned. "That's strange. What is it?" The login used Samuel's account, but it did not come from Samuel's computer. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Ama sat upright. "Are you certain?" "I checked it 3 times. The device identification number is completely different." Joel swallowed hard. He remembered Samuel's insisting that he had never altered any financial records. At the time, no one had believed him. Elijah continued. "Who does the device belong to?" The technician searched again, then answered quietly, "It is registered to the executive office." No one spoke. No one needed to. Everyone understood exactly what that meant. Ama slowly closed her notebook. "The evidence is leading this investigation in a different direction." Joel lowered his head. His shoulders suddenly felt heavy. After several moments of silence, he finally spoke. "There is something I need to tell you." Ama looked at him. "Go ahead." Joel took a deep breath. "I never personally saw anyone alter the files, but," he paused, "I was asked to approve several financial reports before reviewing them completely." Ama immediately asked, "Who asked you?" Joel remained silent. His hands trembled slightly. After a long pause, he answered, "Victor Mensah." Elijah looked directly at him. "Why didn't you report it?" Joel gave a bitter smile. "At first, I thought it was simply part of the internal process. Then, I lost the courage to ask questions." Ama sighed quietly. "If you believed something was wrong, you should have reported it." Joel nodded. "I know I was wrong. I did not alter the records, but I chose to remain silent." His words left the room in complete silence. No one interrupted him. No one judged him. Everyone understood that some failures do not begin with evil actions. Sometimes they begin when good people choose silence. Elijah picked up another folder. This contains visitor records. He opened several pages. Based on Halima's description, a man in a gray suit, a slight limp, a silver ring. The reception team had already compared the visitor log with Halima's description. After several minutes, Elijah stopped at one name, Michael Dube, independent consultant. Joel frowned. "I've never met him." Ama asked, "Who invited him?" Elijah turned the page. He paused. the visitor was received by he looked up. P. Victor Mensah. The room fell silent once again. Every piece now fit together: the USB drive, the security footage, the login records, the unidentified visitor, the envelope, Halima's testimony. P. No details stood alone anymore. Amma closed the file. I am not declaring Victor guilty, but we now have sufficient grounds to open a formal investigation. Elijah nodded. P. I agree. Joel slowly raised his head. His face showed both exhaustion and relief. I will cooperate. I will provide every document I still have. Amma looked at him. P. Thank you. Joel shook his head gently. No, I'm not doing this to be thanked. I'm doing it because I need to make things right. P. Outside the investigation room, Halima quietly replaced the water dispenser in the executive lounge. She had no idea that every detail she had carefully remembered was now being confirmed one by one through surveillance footage, access records, and technical analysis. P. Not a single part of her testimony had been exaggerated. Not one observation had proven inaccurate. Her careful honesty had transformed the opinions of those who had once doubted her. P. Elsewhere in the building, Victor Mensah continued greeting employees with the same confident smile he always wore. He shook hands with business partners, posed for internal publicity photos, and believed everything remained under his control. What he did not realize was that the evidence he had worked so carefully to conceal was quietly assembling itself into a complete picture. The greatest threat to a lie is not someone shouting the truth. It is when small, independent, honest facts begin finding one another. And that entire process had begun with the remarkable memory of a quiet housekeeper who had never once been invited into an executive meeting. At exactly 4:53 p.m., the Green Horizon Board of Directors conference room was filled to capacity. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooked the Atlanta skyline, while the long walnut conference table was surrounded by board members, corporate attorneys, independent auditors, and representatives from the legal department. The formal atmosphere that usually defined executive meetings had been replaced by quiet tension. In front of every attendee lay a thick investigating file containing security footage analysis, electronic access logs, system reports, and written statements collected during the investigation. Victor Mensah entered wearing his usual custom-tailored navy suit. His expression remained calm and confident. He shook hands with several board members, offered a polite smile, and took his seat at the head of the table. He glanced around the room. It looks like everyone came well prepared today. One of the board members answered calmly. This is an important meeting. Victor nodded. I am fully prepared to cooperate. At the opposite end of the table, Dr. Amma Boateng slowly opened her investigation file. Thank you for attending. Today we will review everything related to the community housing project. Victor folded his arms. I also hope everything will be clarified. He sounded completely composed. Anyone unfamiliar with the investigation would have believed he had absolutely nothing to hide. Elijah Kamau stood and turned on the presentation screen. For the first time, we will present evidence that has been independently verified from multiple sources. The security footage appeared, then the electronic door access records, then the system login history. Victor watched quietly. His expression did not change. When Elijah finished, Victor finally spoke. These records only show that I left the meeting. What is unusual about that? Amma answered immediately. Leaving the meeting itself is not unusual, but what is unusual is that you cannot explain why. Victor shrugged. I returned to my office to retrieve some documents. Amma looked directly at him. No documents were brought back. Victor smiled. Perhaps I remembered incorrectly. One of the board members leaned forward. Are you certain your memory is simply mistaken? Victor remained calm. Everyone remembers things imperfectly from time to time. Silence settled over the room again. Amma opened another section of the file. What about Samuel Adeyemi's account being used from a device registered to the executive office? Victor answered without hesitation. I do not manage the IT system. Perhaps the technical department made an error. Elijah spoke calmly. The device identification has already been independently verified. Victor turned toward him. I am not an IT expert. I cannot answer technical questions for them. His composure remained almost perfect. Just then, the conference room door opened. Halima Nwosu quietly walked inside. She was still wearing her familiar golden yellow uniform. Her colorful Ankara scarf rested neatly over one shoulder. Walking beside her was Grace Williams, the certified sign language interpreter. Every person in the room turned to look. Victor hesitated for the first time. The housekeeper, Amma answered calmly. She is here today as a witness. Victor gave a faint smile. A cleaning employee is your witness. No one's responded. Grace pulled out a chair for Halima. Halima remained standing. Her hands rested calmly in front of her. Her eyes moved quietly around the room. There was no anger in her expression. No desire to defeat anyone. She simply wanted to tell the truth exactly as she had seen it. Amma spoke gently. Halima, you only need to describe what happened. You are not here to reach conclusions. Grace translated every word into American Sign Language. Halima nodded. Her hands began to move. Everyone watched carefully. Grace translated each sentence. She saw Mr. Victor carrying a USB drive with a triangular scratch. Halima continued signing. She saw him leave the meeting. She saw him return. She saw him place another USB drive back on the table. Victor immediately interrupted. I object that is only speculation. Grace remained calm. She never said there were two different USB drives. She said the first ones had a scratch, the second one did not. Victor fell silent. Halima continued. She saw a man wearing a gray suit. She saw Mr. Victor hand him a brown envelope. Victor gave a dismissive smile. I meet hundreds of business partners. What does that prove? Halima never looked toward Victor. She simply continued signing. I do not know what they discussed. I do not know what was inside the envelope. I am only describing what my eyes witnessed. When Grace finished translating, complete silence filled the room. One of the senior board members slowly nodded. He turned toward Victor. Do you notice the difference? Victor did not answer. The board member continued. She has never once accused you. She has only described what she observed. Amma placed another file on the table, and every detail she described matches the evidence. Elijah displayed the visitor records. The name Michael Dube appeared on the screen. Victor looked at it. For the first time since the meeting had begun, the confidence in his face weakened, only for a moment, but long enough for Elijah to notice. Amma continued. Can you confirm that you met Michael Dube? Victor answered more slowly than before. Yes, it was a brief meeting. He was a consultant. Amma asked another question. Why did you fail to disclose that meeting earlier? Victor remained silent. A board member leaned forward. You said you simply forgot. What about now? Victor took a slow breath. I forgot. That answer caused several people around the table to exchange glances. No one continued writing. No one argued. His changing explanation spoke louder than any debate. Halima remained standing quietly. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no anger toward Victor. She simply waited while Grace finished translating her final statement. I do not want anyone to be judged because of my words. I only want the truth to be examined. As Grace completed the translation, the chairman of the board slowly rose to his feet. He looked at Halima for several moments before speaking. Thank you. The most valuable thing you have given us today is not what you witnessed. It is the way you presented it. No exaggeration, no omissions, no accusations. Only honesty. Halima gently lowered her head. In that moment, many people in the room realized that the woman they had long thought of as merely the mute housekeeper had demonstrated greater calm, objectivity, and integrity than anyone else during the entire investigation. Victor remained seated. He looked down at the investigation file, then toward Halima. The confidence that had once defined him had disappeared. He finally understood that the greatest threat to his carefully planned deception had not come from powerful executives, legal experts, or advanced technology. It had come from a witness who never tried to prove herself right. When the meeting paused for the board's private deliberations, Halima quietly left the room with Grace. She walked through the familiar hallway with the same calm steps she had always taken while pushing her cleaning cart. Yet no one saw hers the same way anymore. To everyone who had witnessed the hearing, Halima had become living proof that honesty does not need a loud voice. When preserved with patience and given the chance to be heard with respect, it has the power to move even those who sit in the highest positions of authority. At exactly 9:31 a.m., Green Horizon's main atrium was filled with employees. Unlike the company's usual staff meetings, every digital screen throughout the building displayed the same announcements from the board of directors. The promotional videos and business growth charts had disappeared. In their place appeared a simple message that immediately captured everyone's attention. The board of directors has completed its internal investigation and is now announcing its official decisions. Halima Nwosu stood quietly near the back of the atrium beside her familiar service cart. She wore the same neatly pressed golden yellow uniform with her colorful Ankara scarf resting perfectly over one shoulder. She did not move toward the front or seek a place where people could easily see her. That had always been her way. She preferred observing quietly rather than becoming the center of attention. The members of the board of directors walked onto the stage one by one. Dr. Ama Boateng was the first to speak. She looked across the audience before saying calmly, "Today, we are not only announcing the results of an investigation, we are also acknowledging our own mistakes." The entire hall became silent. Ama continued, "After reviewing independent evidence, examining our systems, verifying security records, and carefully comparing every available source of information, the board has determined that the disciplinary action taken against Samuel Adeyemi was incorrect." Employees immediately exchanged glances. Several quietly sighed. Others lowered their heads. Many remembered the conversations they had shared after Samuel had been dismissed. Ama continued. The decision to terminate Samuel Adeyemi's employment has been officially revoked. His professional reputation, employment record, and all related benefits will be fully restored. Applause slowly spread throughout the hall. It was not loud, but it carried genuine relief. The chairman of the board then stepped forward. Holding the official resolution in his hands, he spoke clearly. Regarding Mr. Victor Mensah, the hall immediately fell silent again. Due to serious violations of corporate governance procedures, financial transparency and executive responsibility, Victor Mensah is hereby removed from his position as Chief Executive Officer. Furthermore, the investigation file will be transferred to the appropriate legal authorities for further review. Victor sat in the front row. The confidence that had once defined him was gone. For the first time in many years, he had to listen silently as a decision about his own future was announced without having the power to change it. He slowly stood, looked toward the board, then lowered his head. "I accept the board's decision." No one celebrated. No one mocked him. Everyone understood that the downfall of a person should never become a reason for joy. Afterward, Joel Okoye was invited to speak. He held the microphone for several moments before finding his voice. Finally, he spoke. "I want to apologize, not only for what I did, but also for what I failed to do." The audience listened attentively. Joel continued. "I did not personally create the misconduct, but I chose silence when I should have asked difficult questions." He paused. "My silence caused an innocent colleague to suffer. I will cooperate fully with every future review." The hall became quiet once again. This was no longer simply an announcement of investigation results. It had become a moment of personal reflection. Then Ama spoke again. "There is one more person. I would like to invite her to join us." People looked around the hall. Ama smiled. "Halima Nwosu." Halima looked surprised. She glanced toward Elijah. He smiled warmly and nodded with encouragement. Halima slowly walked toward the stage. Applause began. First from only a few people, then from many more, until the entire audience stood together. Halima looked overwhelmed. She had never stood before such a large crowd. Grace Williams walked beside her. Ama smiled gently. "Halima does not have to give a speech. We simply want to thank her." Halima lightly touched Grace's arm. She signed that she wanted to say a few words. Grace smiled. "I'll interpret." Halima looked across the hundreds of employees standing before her. Her hands began to move. Grace translated carefully. "I never imagined I would stand here. I never wanted any of this to happen." Halima continued signing. "I only did my job. I observed, I remembered. And I told the truth exactly as I saw it." Grace paused briefly, then continued. "If there is one thing worth remembering today, it is not me. It is that, at last, people chose to listen." The audience erupted into applause once more. Some employees wiped away tears. A woman from the administrative department quietly whispered to her colleague, I always thought I was a kind person, but I never learned how to communicate with her. Her co-worker nodded. Neither did I. Elijah stood quietly at the back of the hall. He watched Halima with deep admiration. He remembered the day she had stood beside the security monitor, desperately trying to explain what she had seen using only her hands. If he had walked away that day, as so many others had done before him, everything might have ended very differently. As the applause faded, Samuel Adeyemi entered the hall. He slowly approached Halima. For a moment he said nothing, then he bowed deeply. Finally he spoke. "Thank you. If it hadn't been for you, I would have carried the label of a traitor for the rest of my life." Halima smiled gently. She slowly shook her head. Then she signed. Grace translated. "I did not save you. The truth saved all of us." Samuel smiled. For the first time in many weeks, his smile carried no trace of pain. Before everyone left the hall, the chairman announced one final decision. Beginning today, Green Horizon will establish a workplace access, visibility, and inclusion program. All managers will receive basic trainings in sign language communication. No employee will ever again be overlooked simply because they communicate differently. That announcement moved many people even more deeply than the investigation itself. They understood that the greatest lesson was not that a CEO had lost his position or that an innocent man had been cleared. The greater lesson was that the company had chosen to change the way it listened to people. When the meeting ended, Halima quietly pushed her service cart through the familiar atrium. The glass walls still sparkled. The marble floors still reflected the morning light. The building itself had not changed. What had changed were the eyes that looked at her. No one saw her merely as the woman who could not speak anymore. They saw a colleague who had reminded everyone that a person's true value is never measured by how loudly they can speak, but by the honesty they preserve when protecting the truth. From that day forward, Green Horizon did more than restore one innocent employee's reputation. It learned that a truly strong organization is built by listening to every voice, including the voices that are spoken through quiet hands and unwavering courage. 1 year later, Green Horizon became one of the first companies in Atlanta to receive recognition from the African American business community for creating a truly inclusive workplace. A basic sign language training program was introduced for every manager and frontline employee. Every recruitment event now included certified interpreters, ensuring that all applicants had an equal opportunity to demonstrate their abilities. Samuel Adeyemi returned to his position as a senior accountant, welcomed back with the respect of his colleagues. Joel Okoye took the initiative to redesign the company's internal control procedures so that no one would ever again suffer because others chose silence over integrity. Halima Nwosu did not receive a glamorous executive title, but she was appointed coordinator of the Workplace Inclusion Program. She began teaching managers how to communicate effectively with employees with disabilities and often reminded them that she never wanted special treatment, only equal respect. Whenever she saw new employees greeting her with simple signs they had recently learned, Halima smiled with quiet joy. It was more than the transformation of a single company. It was proof that when people truly learn how to listen to one another, trust can be rebuilt through the smallest acts of respect. The most meaningful part of this story is not that a powerful CEO lost his position or that an innocent employee cleared his name. The real lesson is how easily we judge others based on the way they communicate instead of the values they carry. Many people believe that those who speak confidently deserve more attention, those with impressive titles deserve more trust, and those working behind the scenes should remain invisible. Yet life often proves these opposites. Sometimes the person who sees the truth most clearly is the one nobody notices. Sometimes the most honest individual is the one with the least authority. A truly great organization is not measured only by profit, prestige, or impressive buildings. It is measured by whether every employee is treated with equal dignity and whether every voice is given an opportunity to be heard. This story also reminds us that silence in the face of wrongdoing can cause enormous harm, while simple actions, listening carefully, verifying the facts, and respecting evidence can change many lives. When we learn to judge people by their character instead of their position, we do more than protect justice. We create communities where every person has the opportunity to be respected, understood, and heard. If this story touched your heart, tell us which city you're watching from, share this video with someone you care about, and subscribe for more inspiring stories about truth, courage, and human dignity.